over the summer months, Pastor David and I have been talking about how to help us as a congregation. Think about as we go through 4th of July, all that we go through as a nation. We are so blessed, and at the same time, we face so many challenges, don't we, of how to live together, how to be God's people, how to serve the Lord boldly. And so we've been talking about how we shape character as followers of Jesus, and not only the character of us individually, but the character of Christ's body, the church, how in the midst of all the moral decay and challenge and tension, terror, think of what's happened this last week in Maryland. So people go to work in the field of journalism where we share our ideas, and then something so tragic of a shooting takes place. And so how we live together in the midst of this day. One of the things that I worked for a while in the area of Christian ethics, pastoral ethics. I was challenged by our region of churches to develop a course for our pastors on clergy ethics, how we live with character and moral integrity. And one of the things that we began to talk about very clearly is, while we all have our individual sense of morality and what we think is right and wrong, the reality is ethics are not just what we think, but what together, right, the community of faith says is right. And as Christians, particularly, what God determines and tells us is true and right and good and well for us to be. And so I want you to think about how character is developed in your life, in the life of our church. It doesn't just happen, does it? We don't wake up day. Some days we wake up and we're characters. But whether we have character or not is a whole other matter of faith. Today I want to talk about, as Christian people, how we face our times of failing, like my computer here today. It's talking to itself. I don't even know what it's doing. How we face our failures and disappointments. Building character. So every day when you rise and you go throughout the decisions that you make, and as you go throughout the events of your life, there's something developing within you. And I pray that what develops in you is something of godliness, and the power and love of Jesus Christ, and the tremendous gifts of forgiveness and grace. Because we know if we're not careful, something else begins to build up within us. And it doesn't look like the character we want it to be. Right? And so every day, you and I, and we together, the church, are building character with God's help. Pastor David started the series by talking about integrity. Do you have integrity? I hope you have integrity. But, while it talks about moral goodness and equality, integrity in many forms, it really talks about strength, right? Consistency, an ability to withstand and to hold and to withhold. As we've talked a little bit last week about engineers talking about the integrity of steel, how much can it hold, or chemists will talk about how much heat will take, can a material withstand before it begins to melt or lose its integrity. And so one of the aspects of character is integrity, consistent. There are people that every day that how they're going to approach life, and they're going to bring the tools of life and the tools of faith and the tools that God has placed in it. And other people struggle, don't they? Because they seem to be like ships tossed about the sea without, any direction in their life. So part of that we're talking about is integrity. Last week I talked about the difference between testing and temptation. We all go through both of those experiences in our life. And I want to talk to you about the difference, right, again, between going through times of testing, which make us strong, refiner's fire. The Lord puts us through times of testing, that our integrity and our strength might be built up, and that we might be able to face the different things that we go through, and always keep our sense of who we are with some consistency. But we knew, too, that Satan is going through a different process, tempting us to fall and to break, to give up and to be destroyed. And so as we build our character, right, that integrity of our life, Part of that character is going through times of testing and temptation and learning how to go through them with spiritual awareness, with emotional strength, with God's power at work within us. Paul talks about the tug of war, that often the things that we want to do, we don't do. And the things that we say, Lord, help us, that we might not, sometimes are the biggest struggles of our life. Today I want to talk about how we face our failures and disappointments. And I want to say something very clearly, that godly people fail. Godly people sometimes go through seasons of disappointment. Sometimes there's this kind of false faith that says Christians are always happy. How's that going for you? Or that every day is easy. In fact, the Lord told us that we would go through times of persecution and suffering, even for His name's sake. So we know that godly people, like everybody else, we deal with our own challenges and our own kind of crosses to carry. And so godly people will go through times of failure and disappointment. Sometimes do you ever sense that people come to church, maybe from really challenges in their life, maybe they're coming for the first time or really seeking after something, and they look at a room like you, and this is what they think of you, that you have all the answers, you don't have any problems, and you've got it all together. Oh, if they only knew, right? We all go through times of failings and disappointments. The Apostle Paul said it this way, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Our imperfections, our humanness, our sin, all have fallen short. Those people, quote, those people out there, and quote, those people in here. Paul realizes that all of us come in the need of God's grace and forgiveness and strength because we all fall short of even our own expectations, right? Even more so the glory and the perfection of God. And I love this, but Paul puts these wonderful adjectives, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. So the character that builds from us, we realize our lives are fragile, and God has given us these fragile lives, imperfect, with all its challenges, so that His glory and His strength can be built up within us. Now, I've often said to people, I hope you're a jar of clay and not a cracked pot, right? There's a difference, right? All have fallen short of the glory of God. Something happens in human life that I've watched as we sometimes as Christians go through those times of failures and disappointment. And I want you to challenge you not to go through it this way. We either pretend that nothing's happened and go through a process of denial, right? So we can just put it behind us. Or we go through some justification like, at least I'm not as bad as somebody else. Right? So we measure ourselves against a pretty low bar, and then we rise up to it. Right? Or we somehow go through this piling of the problems and sins of our life till life becomes this mountain of failures and mistakes, and we begin to see ourselves not through the eyes of Jesus who loves us and all the victories that He would win for us, but we see ourselves through the lens of the amount of problems that we now cover. So we need to learn how to, with God's help, face, right? To look squarely within the eyes, to come to terms in a healthy way with the love of God's grace to those moments that we have failed and gone through sometimes significant disappointments. Can you remember a time you failed? Doesn't take too much, does it? If I started telling you all the failures of my life, we would be here well past the hour. Right? But I remember one of the first times that I really came to have to face the failures, and it's hard when those failures kind of smack you right between the eyes. I had been a pretty good high school student, and I was looking forward to college with some confidence that I had all the necessary tools of study and academics, and that I could handle things. I had handled them pretty well in high school and gotten good grades. And I went to college, and because I had had an advanced placement class, I didn't have to take the intro course to one of my major classes. And I was feeling pretty confident in myself. I'm special. I don't have to take all that beginning course that everybody else takes. Well, you're all special. I just want you to know that, but you know how that goes sometimes. So anyway, I go to my first exam in the class feeling quite confident. I had studied with some upperclassmen. I had read the books. I had done what I thought were all the right things. And then I sat down for the exam. And I still remember taking that piece of paper and looking at the first question and saying, "Oh Lord, I don't have a clue about what this first question is. I can make something up, but I don't even know what to make up about this. I don't have any clue at all what it is. I don't even know that I studied. I thought I had been prepared." So, if the first one doesn't go, well, go to the second one, right? Read the second one. "Oh Lord, I don't know anything about that one either." And I read the books and I studied and had done all the right things, but I don't know. And it didn't go much better through the rest of the test. And I remember leaving that room looking for a phone to call my mom to come and get me. I was a freshman, right? I realized that I failed, and I knew when that test was coming back that it was going to have a grade on it. But it was not a grade that I wanted. I had never gotten an F before like that. Lord, what in the world did I do wrong? I had done all the right things, I thought, but I failed. Well, some of you know who had gone to Eastern College, Tony Campolo was the major professor. Dr. Campolo is a wonderful theologian and sociologist and pastor, and he was very funny, so I thought he was going to be easy. That was not the case. But what I discovered in that class is often he would write the exams. He had either written the book or been a part of that development of study. And so when he would write the test, he wouldn't even look at the body. He would ask questions from the footnotes and the endnotes. So when you read that book, you had to read every margin and every part of it. And when he asked all these questions, and if I had taken the earlier class, I might have known some of that. And it was a disaster. I failed. We all fail. Even sometimes, as godly people, when we think we're doing the right things, facing our failures and disappointments. Today I want to look quickly at two characters in the Bible who are godly people, who love the Lord, who have been called by God, gifted by God. And the first one I want to look at is an example, a case study in failure. The failure of a godly person. First of all, David was a wonderful person. Hebrews tells us of all the people that David was a man after God's own heart. He loved the Lord. He always loved him. He was the shepherd boy who was faithful in the middle of the night when David was alone. Sometimes character is described as what you do when nobody else sees you. Right? David, when he was alone in the fields at night watching those sheep, prayed unto the Lord. He sang songs to the Lord. He loved the Lord with all his heart. He was the anointed one, selected by God to be king one day as a young man. When all the other people looked like they might be the characters, Samuel, the prophet, was directed by God to go find one who would be the next anointed one. Saul, the previous king, looked like the right person, but he was not. And David was the one that God saw and anointed and selected to be the king of his people. He was a brave young man who had courage to face Goliath. When everybody else was afraid, David had courage. Courage that came from God. Confidence that came from God. An ability to face the foes in the battles when everybody else was struggling. David was that kind of person. He was the general in Saul's army who won victories for God's people. He was successful. People praised him because of his victorious nature and his ability to overcome. He got things done. And even when King Saul was being praised for being the king, David received many more accolades and praises because of the victories he had won for God's people. He was the king of Israel during its glory days. So he was the epitome of a godly man in every way, a person after God's own heart. But he failed. His pride began to fill him. Think about when you deal with your successes and you're feeling pretty good about yourself, which is wonderful. You should be proud when you have done something well, when you've been victorious and you've gone like David through those successes. But watch out. We saw this last week as Genesis 4 says that sin is always crouching at the door. And so his pride began to fill him. The pressures of kingship began to stretch him. His lust began to consume him. He started under the pressures, and his pride started to look after Bathsheba and pursued her. He did what he thought he would never do. Think about that as Christian people. Sometimes you might look at somebody else and they do something just unthinkable, and you say, look at them. I would never do anything like that. How could they even think about doing that? And we bolster ourselves up to say, I would never do anything as such and such. David did what he thought he would never do. And now he knows he has failed. And he begins to do what I spoke about earlier that we often do. He began to justify himself. Well, it could be worse. And at least I'm not as bad as those other people. And, who hasn't ever made a mistake? And on and on and on. And he began to hide. He did not face his failure, he hid it. Or so he thought. Now, it's never easy to be found out. It's one thing to know that you failed. It's another thing when your failure becomes public. Recently, there was a young man in the church who wound up in some trouble, and he got arrested. It was, unfortunately, he was a good kid. And those things happen, right? Sometimes young people, right? None of you people, young people make mistakes, right? And he got in trouble, and he came to see me because he was hurting. I was thankful that he came. And I remember saying to him, I'm glad you got arrested. And he looked at me like, Pastor, I thought you loved me. And I said, I do. I said, but think about it. If you had not been found out, if you had not gotten in trouble, if you had not been arrested, the next time you got in that situation, you might try it again. And the more times you do it, the easier it gets. And pretty soon you find yourself on a pathway that's pretty broken and pretty destructive. I'm glad you got arrested. I'm glad you got found out, with the hope that he begins to rebuild his life and to make good decisions and be finding strength that God can give. David was found out. God spoke to the prophet Nathan at the time, and he said, you go talk to the king and tell him, I see. When he thinks that he's hiding his sin, when his failures and all that he's done, even though he's a godly person after my own heart, I'm coming to rescue him. Think about it. Sometimes when we get in trouble out of our failures, it's God's intervention and rescue in our life so that we don't hide out in our brokenness. And so Nathan comes to David. It was a risky thing to do, to go to the king and say, hey, buddy, you've messed up. And God knows. And I'm sure Nathan prayed before he went to talk to David. But so he went kind of to go through the back door, and he told a story about, something unthinkable. It was the story of really what David had done in stealing Bathsheba and killing her husband and doing all this stuff that he had done. And David was enraged. He didn't realize at that point he had hidden so well. He said, if anyone did anything like that, they deserve even death. And Nathan says, David, you're the one who's failed. You're the man. Now, this is what happens, though. And this is the wonderful part of the story. David could have become angry and killed Nathan. He could have told him to get out. He could have justified himself. He could have argued, right? He could have done whatever he could have. He was a powerful man. But he went to his knees. And he found the grace of God, who brought him out of his failures to life. Godly people sometimes fail and they make mistakes. And thank God for his grace and mercy when we come to him that restores us fully, not in part, every broken thing. Well, failures are one thing, disappointments come alongside. The story of Elijah that Deb read for us this morning. Elijah was one of the great prophets of Scripture. In the New Testament, it's expected that Elijah will return before the Messiah comes, and so John the Baptist fills the role of Elijah preparing the way of the Lord. Elijah was a spokesman, a prophet for God when it was not a godly time. In fact, it was one of the lowest times of Israel's history. Jezebel was the queen. She was a godless queen. She brought all kinds of idol worship and every kind of crazy idea and foreign, broken God to come to that kingdom. And God's people were not looking much like God's people. And Jezebel was considered a wicked woman. And today we say somebody's a Jezebel, right? They're a betrayer, a harlot, someone who is sold out their soul. Well, Jezebel was the queen, and Ahab, her husband, was not much of a king. And Elijah stood almost alone as the voice of God. So a contest is held because there were all these prophets of Baal, the god of the earth and everything that is human. And so 450 prophets of Baal are gathered, and it's a test. And Elijah says to the prophets of Baal, if your god Baal and all these gods you worship are powerful and real, then call this fire to ignite. And so they gathered wood and they built this massive fire and they danced and they sang and they worshiped Baal, but nothing happened because Baal was no god at all. And then he says, bring water and pour it upon the fire. Like, make it impossible. Just when you think that God cannot, that it's impossible, if that was hard enough, even if the wood were there, put water on it to make it even more so. And so they douse the fire with water, or the sticks there, and he prays. And the living God moves. And fire consumes. And the fire consumed all the prophets of Baal. And it was one of those high water moments. It was a proof that God is able, God is powerful, God hears prayers, God moves. The only problem was Jezebel wasn't too happy about it. And so she threatened, and this is what she said in our scripture. Think about a powerful person, an evil queen says of you, before this day is done, like those prophets were killed, you're going to be gone. I'm going to see to it. So she rose up her army to pursue him. And he fled in fear. So here we went from a high God moment of success and power and prayer and all those things now to being tested. And he's fleeing for his life. And he runs away. And he's afraid. And he gets so disappointed. There's all these images in Scripture. He sits under a juniper tree. This is a picture of a juniper tree. Sometimes they are just a branch. If you looked at the story of Jonah, at the end of Jonah, after he rescues Nineveh and God answers prayer, he is so mad at God for saving those people that he goes and sits under a juniper tree, which probably is not much more than a twig. And it's a day like today, and he's hot and he's miserable. You find the most hot, miserable place today that you can find, and you'd be like Jonah, sitting under that juniper tree. Well, welcome to Elijah. He is so disappointed that now, and so fearful that now he's being pursued. Lord, I prayed and you acted, and why am I going through this? And he sits under this juniper tree, and he says, I wish, and this says it, he says to himself, I wish I could die. I don't want to live. This is miserable. I am so disappointed. So we go through moments, even godly people, of disappointment. And so the story goes, but it continues. He goes off, and he's having his pity party. And an angel of the Lord comes. God comes. And he begins to work in his life. And he nourishes. He says, there's some bread and some drinks. You know, in the midst of disappointment, some breath comes into the room, a cold breeze begins to come. And it says God comes, the angel of the Lord comes again. And it says, get up, Elijah. Why are you so disappointed and discouraged? So down? Have you forgotten who you are? Have you forgotten who I am? Have you forgotten that I've answered your prayers? And this was as there he went into a cave and spent the night, and the Lord appears to Elijah, and the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? I want you to put your name in there in a moment of disappointment that you go through, when you're down in the dumps and having your pity party, right? You, what are you doing here? In the depths of your despair and discouragement, rise. And so the story goes that he went to the mountain of God called Horeb or Sinai, where Moses received the 10 Commandments. And he was still hiding out in the cave. He didn't quite know he was looking for God, but at least he put himself in the proximity of God. He was no longer hiding out. And God comes to him and says, stand at the mouth of the cave, come out of your hiding. And it says that there was a mighty wind, but Elijah didn't hear God in the mighty wind. And then there was an earthquake and the mountain shook, and still he was struggling to find God in despair of his disappointment, and he didn't hear God. And then there was a massive fire, and the fire did not awaken his spirit. It says, and then he heard a still small voice. Elijah, why are you so disappointed? Why are you so broken? Why do you feel like you failed? He starts to cry out to God. No, have you ever done this? He says, I'm the only one. Nobody else. Everybody else is doing their own thing. I'm the only one. God says, oh, there are many. Rise, Elijah, go. And he goes by God's grace and forgiveness back into life. So godly people fail, don't they? Godly people get disappointed. We go through times of testing and temptation and tribulation. But God's grace is a massive and great measure. And I want you to think that the Scripture reminds us that there's never a trial or a moment of failure or disappointment or testing or temptation that the Lord does not provide His strength. So when you go through, and you will, your failures, I hope they don't come with a big red F like I got on my paper or my test that day. But you'll know. Or there'll be moments that people have discouraged you or let you down, or you've let yourself down and you're disappointed. God's grace and forgiveness are in great measure. He loves you, and He'll give you strength to stand again. This is what Winston Churchill said. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. Would you pray with me?